If you're looking for the Swiss Army knife of modern vehicles, look no further than the modern American minivan. And by American minivan, I mean minivan designed for the North American market, not necessarily built in the United States. Although this 2021 Sienna satisfies both of those criteria. It was certainly designed for the North American market, and it was also built in the US. Minivans designed for the North American market tend to be quite different from minivans designed primarily for Europe or Asian markets because of their width. You can see that the Sienna is quite a large vehicle, and that gives us a lot of interior room, especially interior width if you plan on putting adults across the rear of the vehicle or large cargo items inside. Although the Sienna is instantly recognizable as a Toyota and instantly recognizable as a Sienna in my opinion, this is an entirely new vehicle. This is a complete clean sheet redesign for 2021, not a refresh like we see in the Odyssey and in the Pacifica for 2021, or of course the upcoming Kia Sedona for 2022. We find full LED headlights up front, pretty similar to what we find in pretty much all of the modern Toyotas in America. LED turn signals as well inboard, which is a nice touch. Standard radar adaptive cruise control on all models. We'll get to the active safety features a little bit later. And then we have this really large grille down here, which is not entirely functional. Because this is a hybrid vehicle only, we have a small intake right there and a small intake down lower, but the vast majority of this enormous grille is just there for show. As are these large grille-looking style elements between the headlights and the fog lights. I'm actually a little surprised that these didn't end up being functional. They could have used those perhaps to relieve pressure up front like we see in some luxury vehicles, create an air curtain around the front tire, but in this Sienna, they do absolutely nothing. The Sienna's new front-end design reminds me a little bit of the rear-end design on BMW 5 Series and 7 Series from a few generations ago, the one that Chris Bengal designed. Rather than having a Bengal butt, this one has a Bengal front. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comments section. It has kind of a two-tiered effect going on. We do again find a radar adaptive cruise control sensor right there in the Toyota logo because adaptive cruise control, autonomous braking, lane keeping assistance, and blind spot warning are standard on all versions of the Sienna. That puts this in the lead in terms of active driver assistance technologies standard in every model. If you want blind spot monitoring in your Odyssey, you have to move one level up from the base model, and in the Pacifica, you have to add a $1,000 package. Of course, it's worth noting that the Pacifica is still likely going to be less expensive than the Sienna. Now, at this point in time, I know what the Sienna costs, but I can't tell you about it because Toyota has asked me to keep that secret until that embargo date down there at the bottom of your screen. That's also when you can come back and find out how the Sienna drives. In this video, I'm going to be talking about everything else about the Sienna, why you might want it, why you might not want it, how it compares to the rest of the minivan competition, or Toyota's own Highlander, which I think is probably the most direct competitor to the Sienna. If you're minivan shopping right now, I would say put your purchase on hold at least until you see part 2 of this video, but also keep in mind that we're seeing some significant changes in the minivan segment right now. We're getting a refreshed Pacifica with all-wheel drive finally. Formerly the Sienna was the only all-wheel drive option in this segment. We got a minor refresh to the Odyssey, and we're going to see a significant refresh to the Kia Sedona as well. But of course, we're here to talk about the Sienna, which has grown a little bit for 2021. This is just over 204 inches long if you get the XSE trim. The bumper changes a little bit up front, so the rest of the versions of the Sienna are a tiny bit shorter. The Sienna is just about as closely related to the Highlander as it is any other modern Toyota in the United States, but this is much more focused on passenger carrying and cargo practicality than the Highlander. That's really obvious when we take a look at some of the features, not just the fact that we have sliding doors, but the fact that they're foot operated on both sides. There's a little sensor right there under the door, in addition to having a foot operated liftgate. The long-running reason to get a minivan over a crossover or an SUV is the amount of interior room that we find and the ease of getting in and out. We don't have ground clearance that's nearly as high as some of those modern crossovers, and that means that the step-in height is an awful lot lower, the floor is closer to the ground, and then the box being so large means that we have much more room inside. You can really see the difference between this and something like a Highlander when you park them side by side and you look at the ceiling height and the floor height. As with most minivans, the rear-end styling can best be described as boxy practical. We have a version of what we saw up front with the two-tiered design. This reminds me a little bit again of the Chris Bengal designs in BMWs from a while ago. We have partial LED tail lamps with a pretty significant split here. It kind of looks like a fishtail from the side. The tail lights are LEDs for the brake light and the parking light, but the turn signal and backup lights are incandescent. The XSE trim is theoretically the sporty version of the Sienna, but it doesn't change the handling ability or the power level. Instead, we just get blacked out accents like the Sienna logo right there, blacked out trim at the bottom of the bumper, the black wheels, and the trim up front. If you're looking for the most efficient minivan in America, look no further than the 2021 Sienna. All Siennas are going to be available only with Toyota's 2.5-liter 4-cylinder hybrid system. This is closely related to the hybrid system that we find in the Camry, Avalon, RAV4, and Lexus ES, and essentially identical to the hybrid system that we find in the Toyota Highlander, all-wheel drive system included. At the heart of this system is a 2.5-liter 4-cylinder naturally aspirated engine that's paired with 2 electric motor generator units up front and optionally an additional motor in the back. That gives you 243 horsepower combined, exactly the same power output that we find in the Highlander, and 35 to 36 miles per gallon combined. Oddly enough, also the same as the Highlander. That puts the Sienna 6 miles per gallon ahead of the only other hybrid option in the segment, the Pacifica hybrid, but the Pacifica is a plug-in hybrid, so it will give you an electric range. Your fuel economy will vary based on how you're driving this and how you're driving that Pacifica hybrid, but if you want to shift some of your consumption over to electricity, that you can do in the Pacifica, you won't be able to do in this. But this is going to get almost double the fuel economy of any other minivan available in America. Most minivans in daily driving, if you're driving close to the EPA cycle, will be getting you about 20 mpg. This will be getting you 36 according to the EPA, and very much like the Toyota Highlander, if you treat it gently, you can logically get better than that. As before, the Sienna is available with all-wheel drive, but it's a very different all-wheel drive system than we had before. Rather than a mechanical linkage from the transmission to the rear axle, we get a separate rear electric motor. It's rated for 54 horsepower and 89 pound-feet of torque. Rather unfortunately, this Sienna is not the all-wheel drive version. However, it's going to drive very much like the all-wheel drive version of the Highlander hybrid or the RAV4 hybrid, which also use a rear electric motor setup. In general terms, rear electric motors can't deliver as much torque or as much power as mechanical all-wheel drive systems if there's complete front-wheel slip, say in the previous generation of the Sienna. But if you're looking for a minivan with all-wheel drive, you have exactly 2 options for 2021. You have the all-wheel drive system in this Sienna or the mechanical all-wheel drive system in the Chrysler Pacifica. And if you want a hybrid with all-wheel drive, you have one option. It's this one right here. Since this is the same hybrid system that we find in the Highlander, it should not surprise you that towing capacity is the same as the Highlander at 3,500 pounds. That puts this right up there with the best in this segment. The Pacifica could theoretically tow 3,600 pounds, but the Pacifica hybrid has a tow rating of 0. Before we jump inside, I'll connect a few dots for you. If you're wondering what the Sienna is like to drive, remember that this has the same hybrid system that we find in the Highlander hybrid. It's a little bit heavier, 200 to 300 pounds heavier, depending on the model that we're talking about. It's a little bit closer to the ground, and it has similarly sized tires. So that should give you an idea of what this is like to drive, because the Highlander and the Sienna are relatively closely related within the Toyota envelope. They're both built on Toyota's TNGA platform. Obviously, the 2 vehicles are tuned for different customers. This is, again, more family-focused. The Highlander theoretically has a bit more of an off-road or soft-road mission, but you can get a general idea of how they behave out on the road by checking out my full video on the Highlander Hybrid. There are probably links down there in the description, or of course, you can just search on the channel. I found front seat comfort to be excellent in this XSE trim. We have a 4-way adjustable lumbar support, which I really appreciate, a nice upright driving position, and a manual tilt telescopic steering column with a pretty decent range of motion. As crossovers and even some SUVs have tried to adopt more car-like driving positions, minivans are still one of the few vehicles out there, aside from some large pickup trucks, where you can get a really upright driving position. So if you prefer sitting in a car seat a little bit more like you'd be sitting in a lounge chair or a kitchen chair at home, you might want to be looking at a minivan. There's also a lot of headroom and a lot of legroom. You can move this front seat pretty far backwards, so if you're a taller person, have longer legs or a longer torso, this is going to be a little bit more comfortable than some of those crossovers that you might want to be comparing to the Sienna. On the downside, this trim does not have a passenger seat with the same range of motion as the driver's seat. It is missing the adjustable lumbar support. In case you're wondering, the battery for the hybrid system lives under the driver and front passenger seats. You can see one of the cooling grills right there under the driver's seat. There's an identical one over there on the passenger seat. This is a 1.9 kilowatt hour nickel metal hydride battery pack, basically the same battery technology that we see in a wide variety of Toyota's hybrids. Interior roominess is clearly one of the big reasons to get a minivan over the average 3-row crossover. With just under 119 inches of combined legroom, you find more legroom in this minivan, front row plus second row plus third row, than any 3-row crossover sold in the United States. This actually gives you more room than many full-size SUVs available as well. And along with that, we have an enormous cargo area, which we're going to take a look at in a bit. If you want more passenger room for your 8 passengers, or more cargo room, or a combination thereof, you're going to have to be looking at very large SUVs like a Chevy Suburban. Although you will find a little bit more room in certain dimensions in the Suburban, especially back there in the cargo area, that doesn't mean that the second row and third row in the Suburban are going to be any more comfortable than the modern minivan, and it's certainly going to be far less efficient. 36 miles per gallon in this model, about 20, 18 if you're lucky, something along those lines in the most efficient versions of the Suburban. Toyota gives us a sliding second row seat with an enormous range of motion. You can see that these tracks are almost about 4 feet long or so. You can push the second row seat all the way back there to where it touches the third row seat's bottom cushion, and then if I stick my legs all the way out, my feet aren't even touching the front seat. That's all the way back in its tracks. I had a 6'5" person sitting in there. I'm 6 feet tall. My feet sticking out like that won't touch that front seat back. There's a ton of legroom going on here, or of course you can apportion the space any way you prefer. One thing that surprised me is that the second row seats don't have as much recline as I had hoped. That's all the recline that you get. With as much motion as these seats have in the sliding direction, I had expected them to practically go flat. Of course, if you want an even more luxurious experience in your minivan, you can get the top-end trim of the Sienna, in which we get ottomans, and you can see that those ottomans would be really useful in here, much more useful, honestly, than in the reclining seats or ottomans that we find in the Lexus LS, because there's simply more legroom going on here. As before, the Sienna is available as either a 7 or an 8-passenger minivan, so 2 people up front, 2 or 3 here in the middle, and then 3 people in the back. But one big change versus the previous generation Sienna is that these second row seats do not come out of the minivan at all. They are always going to be here. This is very similar to what we see in the Kia Sedona, but very different than we find in the Pacifica, where they fold flat into the floor, or the Honda Odyssey, where at least you can remove them from the minivan. According to the engineers, the reason that these seats don't come out of the minivan is that they incorporated an airbag into the seat itself. That gives the occupant the same level of protection whether the seat is slid all the way backwards or all the way forwards, because the airbag is moving with you. And clearly Toyota didn't want you plugging and unplugging airbags. That doesn't sound terribly safe. On the other hand, there is that loss of practicality, and Toyota chose not to make these seats fold flat into the floor or anything along those lines. Now, it is worth noting that as a result of these seats not folding flat into the floor, they are more comfortable than the fold flat second row seats that we find in the Chrysler Pacifica. The Pacifica Hybrid has more comfortable seats because, like this, they don't go flat into the floor, but they still come out of the minivan. Now, these seats do collapse forward. If I pull that little lever right there, you can see that they collapse and they scoot forward against the front row seats, but they don't go as far forward as the seats that we find in the Kia. And because of the way this seat moves, you cannot leave a child seat latched into place and tilt and slide it forward like that. The only thing you'd have to do right there is just slide the seat all the way forward until it touches that front seat back. The lack of that feature is a little bit more of a concern in something like the Highlander, because in a minivan we do have a larger and boxier door opening, so you can more easily get in and out of the third row. Tilting and sliding the second row seat will give you easier access to the third row rather than simply sliding the seat, because it will move even further forward. However, accessing the third row is still going to be pretty easy in a minivan. You could also walk through the middle if you get the 7-passenger version like we're driving here. And once you're back in the third row, we find a third row seat that's wider and certainly more comfortable than the average 3-row crossover as well. I'm 6 feet tall again. At my height, I can easily sit upright here. I have about half an inch of headroom left. You will find a little bit more headroom in a Chrysler Pacifica, but this is still perfectly acceptable for adults. And because of the extreme width between these wheel wells, more than we find in the average 3-row crossover, this third row bench is significantly more comfortable than the one that we find in the Highlander. Whether I want to sit in the middle right here, I still have tons of headroom, or sit on one of the outboard sides. As you'd expect of an area that's going to be used for cargo a lot of the time, we find hard plastics back here on the sides, no soft touch armrests or anything like that for the third row passengers, but we do find 2 cup holders on each side, some USB charge only ports on the right side, and then latch anchors for all 3 seating positions. Cargo capacity and cargo practicality is a key reason that you might want to get a Sienna over the average 3-row crossover, or even a number of full-size SUVs. Behind this third row, we find 33.5 cubic feet of storage space. That's nearly triple some of the smaller 3-row crossovers out there. And the cargo area is a very practical shape as well. We have this really deep cargo well, so you can put a lot of items back here. In our 24-inch roller bag test, the Toyota Highlander was able to fit just 2 24-inch roller bags, but we were able to squeeze 6 of them back here just barely if this third row was in its most upright position, which was still relatively comfortable because we get a lot of third row headroom. Now, in this model, there is no spare tire. A spare tire is not standard on the Sienna, but it is optional. But there's a key thing you should know about that, and that it does reduce the cargo capacity, number one, but it also changes the way that the body works here on the inside, on the driver's side of the Sienna. You lose this deep storage while here. It also appears that you lose the cup holders back there on the left side. That's because the spare tire would occupy almost this entire area on the left side. In the model that we're driving right here, behind this little door, we simply find the can of Fix-A-Flat and the air compressor. As before, the third row folds easily into the floor, and it's a very simple one-handed operation. We pull handle number one and then push it right down there into the floor. To bring it back up, They are hydraulically assisted, so we simply lift it right there and then pull this handle to bring the seat back where you want it. As you'd expect out of a minivan, the trunk comfort index is a solid 10 out of 10 points, and that's because this cargo area is extremely deep. You can put a lot of cargo back here in a minivan. You could put 24-inch roller bags easily in this cargo well, and they would still be just under this lip. Practical touches are everywhere back here, like the subwoofer that's integrated into the hatch rather than occupying space on one side of the cargo area. Grocery bag holders integrated into the third row to keep your groceries from sliding around everywhere. And I really like the fact that Toyota didn't just give us this 1500 watt outlet right here, they also gave us one in the center console. Now it's 1500 watts for both together, not 1500 watts separately, but I love the fact that they gave us 2 electric outlets. That's not quite as snazzy as the upcoming Ford F-150 that promises to allow you to run a demo hammer and a cement mixer at the same time, but it should be enough to power this small microwave. It's also powering the lights that we're using to help film this episode. If you get the top end trim of the Sienna, then you also get a small refrigerator unit integrated into the center console. I'll show you a picture of that right here. This model doesn't have it, so I just had to reach into the freezer at home and grab some frozen bacon. So what else should we be trying in our microwave Sienna test than bacon? Let's just go ahead and pop that in there, set it for 1 minute. And the car hasn't blown up yet, so we are successfully microwaving our bacon. Don't worry, you're not forced to microwave from the second row because there's a second outlet back here in the cargo area, and they deliver, again, that combined 1500 watts. Let's see how we're doing. Oh, bacon needs a little bit longer. I like my bacon moderately crispy, so in we go again. Obviously, there's a certain ridiculous novelty in cooking bacon in your minivan. I guess you could if you really wanted to, but more practical applications for this would, of course, be game consoles, or if you were going to go camping and you wanted to put a small refrigerator in the back of your minivan, something along those lines, you definitely could if the factory refrigerator wasn't large enough. Of course, if you had a short-term power outage at home, you could also power lights with your minivan. As we look around the interior together, keep in mind that I am in an XSE trim, so there are going to be features that you'll find in the top-end trim that we don't see in here. Likewise, some features in here that we don't see in the base model. And this is a pre-production model of the Sienna, so there may be a few fit and finish touches that are not quite right as we look around, although it seems that everything is very well buttoned down in here. We find the controls for the rear hatch, side doors right there, the power moonroof that we have in this model. This is a pretty standard-sized moonroof just over the driver and front passengers' heads. If you're looking for a minivan with a panoramic moonroof, this is not going to be the minivan for you. We have just this one moonroof option. We have height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger and two-way adjustable headrests. These seats are upholstered in Toyota's imitation leather upholstery, and you can see that the center section of that seat back cushion has a really interesting texture to it. It's sort of embossed on there, trying to make it look perhaps like crocodile or alligator or something along those lines. We then have orange stitching around the sides of the seats in the XSE trim. Bolstering is not terribly aggressive on the seat back or seat bottom cushion, and as you can see, that seat bottom cushion doesn't have that same texturing going on. The front doors are made from a combination of different materials. We have a soft touch armrest with more of that orange stitching going on there, soft touch injection molded upper section of the door with what looks like a stitch line, but that's actually just an injection mold line. And then we find hard plastics at the bottom of the door right around the bottle holder, and those other little storage cubbies down there, and that speaker grill. The design of the Sienna's interior is definitely a departure from the previous Sienna, but you can see that this is going in a similar direction to a lot of Toyota's crossover lines with extra storage cubbies all the way around the dashboard, the most notable of which is this really long one that extends from all the way over there on that passenger side all the way through here to the middle. You can see it's right at that same height all the way over here to the passenger side, right by the engine start-stop button and the steering column. This storage area is certainly large enough to store a large number of smartphones, and there's even a wireless charging mat right there in the middle for some of those smartphones if you want to do that. The dashboard is made in several different parts. We have a hard plastic upper section, soft touch right there with the orange accents, some metallic effect trim, hard plastic again just above that storage shelf right there, and then soft touch materials where your knees would touch the center console or, of course, the dashboard. Below that orange trim, we have a moderately sized glove compartment. I was not able to fit a 10-inch tablet inside. In the middle of everything, we have a standard 9-inch color touchscreen infotainment system. This is running basically the same software that we see in a variety of different Toyota models, but I have to say I was a little surprised that we don't find the enormous screen optional in here that we do find available in the Toyota Highlander. That said, this screen is about the same size as the largest screens you'll find in this segment. It looks like the Chrysler Pacifica may be getting a slightly larger screen, but the rest of the competition have screens right about this size. Over here on this side, you can see who has their seatbelt on in the vehicle. On either side of the screen, we have some physical buttons and knobs, which is certainly my preference. As you can see, we have smartphone integration right there, Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. It uses the entire screen, and then basically the same software package that we see in a wide variety of different Toyota models. Below the infotainment system, we find the controls for either the standard 3-zone climate control system or the optional 4-zone system. This particular model has the optional 4-zone system. You can see left and right rear temperatures right there in the middle. I can hit this rear button here and then use the front toggles to change the rear temperature. Heated seats in this particular model, the controls are right there. Again, that wireless charging mat below those HVAC controls. And then the only USB input for the infotainment system is right over here on the driver's side. I found that a little bit of an awkward place because it leaves the cord dangling around if you do want to use Apple CarPlay or Android Auto. I wish it had been secreted away somewhere. Under this center console, we have a decently sized storage area, which we're going to look at in a bit. It could have been hidden down there with some sort of cable pass-through. We have 2 cup holders right here. This one also has, I guess what you could say is a smartphone slot right there. You can put your smartphone like that. 2 large cup holders there. This is what the key looks like in the new Sienna. As you'd expect, there are buttons for the 2 sliding doors and the power hatch. I was surprised that Toyota opted for a pretty traditional console shifter. Drive is back there, sport mode's over to the left. That's also where we find the manual mode. If they'd used a joystick or digital push button style shifter, it would have made the center console a little bit less bulky, and as we'll see in a bit, that does take up some of the room under this console. Behind the shifter, we have the drive mode selector button right here, an EV mode button, brake hold, and then an electric parking brake button. Then behind door number 2, we find 2 extra cup holders. These are a little bit smaller than the other ones, so if you had some of those smaller takeout drinks, you might want to put them in here to keep them from rolling around. And if you had some of those larger drinks, you'd put them right up there. There's also a little bit of a slot there where you could easily put smartphones or other knickknacks. Between the front seats, we find softly padded armrests for the driver and front passenger. Charge-only ports for the second row seats. This is a bag or purse holder, whatever you want to use that for. You just drape the handles over there and it'll keep it in place. And then we find a very large storage bin right here. You could easily put a gallon of milk inside. There's some additional USB ports in there as well. Under the center console, we have an even larger storage area where you could put bags, shopping, groceries, your purse, etc. But you can see this bulge right here on the driver's side. That's there because of that more traditional shifter. It's a little bit more obvious if we look at things from the passenger side. You can see how much more room would be available if they'd used a different shifter design. On the driver's side, we have an instrument cluster that's very similar to the rest of Toyota's hybrid lineup. We have a power, eco, and charge gauge on the left, and a speedometer over here on the right. One of the reasons that we have these gauges so far apart in this particular model is that in other trims we have a larger LCD in the middle, but in this particular model we just have this relatively small, approximately 4.5 to 5 inch display here. This gives us things like our typical trip computer readouts, active safety readouts. You can change some vehicle settings here. You can see the status of the hybrid system, the tire pressure there. This display is where you would adjust things like the parking sensors, blind spot monitoring, collision warning system, lane tracing assistant, etc., rather than in the infotainment system. The steering wheel is a round 3-spoke design with perforated leather inserts on the sides and then plain leather inserts on the bottom and on the top. As with other modern Toyota vehicles, the controls for the cruise control system are here on the steering wheel rather than on a separate stalk that moves with the steering wheel. We find the infotainment buttons split on each side, so track forward, backward on the right, volume up, down, and voice command over here on the left. This multi-button arrangement controls that multifunction LCD in the instrument cluster. We then have a dedicated phone button. To the left of the steering wheel, we find another small storage tray that mimics the one that we found in the center. And then this is where we would find additional buttons like the automatic high beam control, the control for the AC inverter, power door disable button as well. Thanks for watching, and be sure to come back and watch part 2 of this video where I can tell you how much the Sienna costs and what it's like to drive. But at this point, I can safely say if you're looking for the most efficient minivan in America, one of the only minivans with all-wheel drive, and if you're looking for something with a really roomy interior and likely the highest reliability rating in this segment, you should definitely be looking at the Toyota Sienna. In general terms, the hybrid version of a vehicle in Toyota's lineup tends to be the most reliable engine option, and for 2021, that's the only engine option in the Sienna. So this is probably going to be a little bit more reliable than the last generation model. Obviously, bearing in mind that there could be some teething troubles with the launch of the Sienna, if I were shopping purely on predicted reliability, this is absolutely the model that I would get. I'll talk about this a little bit more in part 2, but the downsides to the Sienna are the fact that we don't have a spare tire standard. You can get one, but that does eat up some cargo area in there. We don't have a mechanical all-wheel drive system anymore like we did find in the last Sienna. That's generally speaking going to make this a little bit less capable than the last Sienna. or the Pacifica with its mechanical all-wheel drive system. And we don't have second row seats that allow you to leave a child seat latched into place and still tilt and slide them forward to have easier access to the third row. I do think that's one important omission in the Sienna, and one reason that you might want to get something like the Pacifica over this. We don't have those fold-in floor second row seats, but we don't find those in the Kia or the Honda Odyssey either. The other auto omission in my mind are the second row seats, which don't come out of the Sienna at all. Now, way back when Kia first did this with the Sedona, they said that in their research, many people don't ever remove the second row seats from their minivan. So I'd love to hear from all of you. Do you ever take the second row seats out of your minivan if you have one? I remember as a kid and family members that currently have minivans, etc., that the second row seat was always being taken in and out for various things. You know, when my parents wanted to go pick up a 4x8 sheet of plywood somewhere, or when a family member needed to move, you could take out all the seats, get all of that extra cargo room, and you could put some really large items in a minivan that you just couldn't put in your average 3-row crossover, like a Toyota Highlander. So I am a little bit sad that that loss of practicality has been excised from the Highlander, but if you're the kind of person that never takes the second row out, it's not really going to make a big difference. With that out of the way, all that's left to talk about is how much the Sienna costs and what it's like to drive, but again, you'll have to come back for that. I'll see all of you then.